Former Alabama Supreme Court Chief Justice Roy Moore won the GOP Senate nomination for his state this past week. In 2005, he appeared on Book TV's Afterwards program to discuss his book, So Help Me God. It's about his tenure and ouster from the state's Supreme Court because of his placing a Ten Commandments monument in the courthouse. In this interview, Bill Press does the questioning. This program from 2005 is part of Book TV's archives, available anytime by visiting our website, booktv.org.
Roy Moore, welcome.
Well,
welcome to Afterwards.
Nice to be here.
Your book, So Help Me God, is a combination of sort of memoir and political call to arms. You talk about your life coming up from growing up dirt poor to going all the way to West Point, going to law school, becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Alabama. And mostly you talk about the event for which you're most famous, or events around which you're most famous, and that is placing this monument to the Ten Commandments in the rotunda of the State Judiciary Building down in Montgomery, Alabama. Why did you do it?
Well, initially I was decorating the courtroom, and of course I realized that God was the source of our moral law, and I had carved the Ten Commandments back in 1980, so I decided to put that above my bench. And it was an act not to force anybody to believe a certain way or force him, but just to acknowledge God and higher law.
But you do believe, as I've read your book, in the separation of church and state, don't you?
Absolutely. Separation of church and state, I think that's one of the greatly misconstrued concepts. Actually, I find it coming from the Bible, where God ordained the priest out of the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, and the kings out of the tribe of Judah, the family of David. And throughout the scriptures, you see where God kept separate those things which belong to civil government and those things which belong to His church.
What do you tell a lot of religious conservatives today, such as the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who think that, and Pat Robertson, who think the separation of church and state is wrong?
Well, I think that that's going to an extreme that's not right. Separation of church and state is not wrong. Separating God and state is wrong. And I think that's what Reverend Falwell and Reverend Robertson are referring to, because they have been deceived, or they're adopting the common ordinary understanding of separation of church and state, which is to separate anything from God from the state, and that is wrong.
So you believe in separation of church and state. Do you believe the Constitution says we should not establish an official religion in this country?
Absolutely. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, being the first part of the First Amendment. And I agree with that 100%, but religion and God are not synonymous. Religion was defined by the United States Supreme Court and by our founding fathers as the duties which we owed to God and the manner of discharging those duties.
And you don't deny, do you, that the monument to the Ten Commandments is a religious monument? It's not a historical monument. It's a religious monument.
Absolutely. It acknowledges the sovereign God. And that's the reason the court said I could not display the monument, because it had a religious purpose to acknowledge God. And this is something we didn't deny throughout the trial, because there's no law respecting that. There's a law respecting the establishment of religion.
Well, Judge, there's what I don't understand.
Sure.
If you believe in the separation of church and state, and you don't think we should establish one religion over another, and you plant a religious monument in a state office building, you have violated the Constitution of the United States.
No. The word religion in the First Amendment does not mean God. You know the first thing our forefathers did when they wrote the First Amendment and they finished the words on September 25th, 1789? They asked the President of the United States to declare a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many and signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a constitution of government for their safety and happiness. And 8 days later he did that. In other words, their first act was to acknowledge God. You have to understand, I think the thing that people fail to understand today is that God is the author of our religious liberty. It was He that gave us the right to believe what we want, not government.
Well, Judge, a federal court in Alabama said you were wrong.
Yeah.
A federal appeals panel said you were wrong. The Alabama Supreme Court, your colleagues, said you were wrong. The Supreme Court of the United States said you were wrong. The Republican Attorney General of Alabama said you're wrong, and the Republican Governor of Alabama said you were wrong. Are you saying they're all out to lunch and you're the only guy that's right here? They said this was a violation. This was an establishment of a religious monument in a state building.
Now let me approach each one of those people you've addressed.
Well,
First,
we only have
the
a little
federal
time, but
the
go ahead.
federal judge said he did not know how to define the word religion. Indeed, thought it was dangerous and unwise to define the word. He put himself above the law. The 11th Circuit merely upheld his decision, and the United States Supreme Court declined to even consider the matter. They didn't say I was wrong. The Attorney General himself asked on the Court of the Judiciary hearing, would I continue to acknowledge God, even if officials tell you can't? Well, of course I will, because every state acknowledges God. Alabama, for example, says that we establish justice according to we establish justice invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. So these people retain their jobs, perhaps, Attorney General and Governor, by accepting an order, an unlawful order of a federal district judge. We've got to understand that every order of a judge is not law.
No, that's right. But when you have, Judge, it seems to me, I mean, looking as an outsider, you've got the federal level, the state level, and then the United States Supreme Court, okay, refusing to hear the case, but that certainly means they thought the lower courts were in the right. You say that the judge put himself above the law. It looks to us, some of us, like you put yourself above the law, and you said, I know the law better than anybody else, and that's what I'm going to do.
You've got to understand that the words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, have meaning. And you've got to define those words, do you not? For example, is a monument a law? Does a monument forbid you to do anything or prohibit your conduct in any way? Does it mandate you do anything?
No, but I think the question is the monument the establishment or the recognition of one religion over another? And the answer, according to most of the courts, and according to everybody but Roy Moore, is yes.
Well, that's because the courts are not going by law, they're going by their feelings and not by the law. It's quite simply that the First Amendment doesn't forbid the acknowledgement of God. It didn't when it was written, it didn't for a century or two later, and it doesn't today. In fact, if Congress doesn't make a law, how can the Supreme Court interpret a law Congress can't make? What they're doing is making laws to withdraw from our public square any acknowledgement of a sovereign God, which is completely improper and contradicts the United States Supreme Court's own precedent, like 1931 in U.S. versus McIntosh. In this case, the United States Supreme Court, in both a majority and minority opinion, said that religious liberty comes from an obedience to the will of God. Now, if the United States Supreme Court recognized God, why can't I?
Who ever tried to stop you from recognizing God?
The Attorney General, Bill Pryor, on the Court of the Judiciary hearing said this, will you continue to acknowledge God as you said you would today, even if officials tell you you can't? It was always about the acknowledgement of God.
In your court, when you took your oath, you said, so help me God,
Sure.
Correct? Did anybody stop you?
No.
When you took your oath, you put your hand on the Bible, didn't you?
That's right.
Anybody stop you?
No.
No. When you open your sessions, you open your courtroom with a prayer, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Anybody stop you?
No.
So what do you mean? The only time they said that you say they stopped you from acknowledging God is when you put this monument in the state rotunda.
Exactly. When they said...
But if I can finish that. Okay, to acknowledge God doesn't mean that you can do anything you want, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that you can tell people how to think or how to believe. But the point is, a monument merely recognizes that there's a God. And you look out at the Ninth Circuit. What did they do? They took under God out of the pledge. What are the courts doing when the Supreme Court of the United States opens with God save the United States of this honorable court and then says that children can't pray in school? What are they doing? They're forbidding the acknowledgement of God.
Now, I saw the video down there in Alabama. There were people coming into the rotunda. They saw the monument. They were kneeling and praying. They were gathering there. They were singing hymns. You turned that rotunda into a religious shrine. You tell me that that's not establishment of one religion over another?
No. That is an acknowledgement of God, and when people come in there, they're free to do what they want. They can kneel. Listen.
What God?
They can.
What God?
The God of the Holy Scriptures. The God upon which this nation was founded.
Which is what God?
The God of the Holy Scriptures.
Which is
the
what
Bible.
God?
It's the God of this Bible. It's the God that gave the Ten Commandments. The God of Mount Sinai.
Is this the Buddhist God?
No, it's not the Buddhist God.
What God is it? That's what I'm asking.
It's the God of the Holy God that gave the Ten Commandments.
You're saying this is Judeo-Christian God?
The Judeo-Christian God. Of course.
What if I'm sure there's a Buddhist community in Alabama. What if they wanted to put a statue of Buddha in the rotunda
Sure.
of the state building. I'm sure
If there was a
you would
Buddhist,
support it.
if the Buddhist was a Chief Justice, no, I wouldn't support it because it doesn't represent what this country was founded upon. But if there was a Buddhist Chief Justice that desired to put a monument there, nothing in the law would stop it because he has not established a religion. You've got to understand that you're saying what I supported. It doesn't matter what I would support or what I wouldn't support.
It does.
It's
No, it
what,
does.
No, it
No,
doesn't.
it does because it shows whether or not you're consistent. And I think it gets to the fallacy in your argument, which is you say you're not favoring one God over another, but
Right.
in fact, you are.
No,
Because you just said
there is only one God. Let's get that straight. There is one God upon which this nation was founded. It's not Buddha, and it's not Hinduism, and it was not the Muslim God. It was the God of the Holy Scriptures. And I can take you back through history, and I can show you that.
But you know what? In this country, God bless America,
Sure.
not everybody believes that, Judge. There are a lot. And let me just say, just the other day, I was in this building, and there was a young Hindu man, and he was there to talk about this issue, which was recently before the Supreme Court.
Sure.
And he said when he walked in and saw that monument, he was offended because that Bible, that Ten Commandments, is not in his faith at all, means nothing to him at all. And he sees that, and he sees the state saying, you believe in this, buddy, or you're un-American. Doesn't that register with you?
Oh, of course it does, but being offended is not a constitutional violation. Where in the Constitution does it say that if you're offended, you've got a constitutional violation? I may be offended at your tie,
no,
but that doesn't make it unconstitutional.
No, but where in the Constitution does it say that you can press and push your religion on other people?
No one is pressing or pushing a religion. You've got to understand the acknowledgement of the Judeo-Christian God is not religion, and nobody's forcing it. And besides that, no Hindu, no Buddhist, or anyone would say this nation was founded on anything but the Christian faith, the acknowledgement of the God who gave the Ten Commandments.
Well, we'll get back to that issue in a second.
Okay.
But you do make a lot of the fact that you think this judge, you said actually in the book here several places that the First Amendment requires you as an elected official to acknowledge God. Is that correct?
The First Amendment, you've got to recognize that without the First Commandment, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me, there would be no God who gave us freedom of conscience.
No.
That freedom of conscience is protected from interference by the First Amendment. So without the acknowledgement of that God, there would be no First Amendment to the United States Constitution.
No, but that wasn't my question. You say in this book that you are required
Well,
by the First
for
Amendment
an understanding of the First Amendment, if you understand what the First Amendment gives, that you would acknowledge that there is a God. Now, let me give you...
No. So the First Amendment, you say, requires you to acknowledge God.
The First Amendment, for basic understanding of what it secures, you must acknowledge God to understand that. It doesn't say that you're going to be prosecuted for not acknowledging God. Let me show you the elementary catechism that was put to the schools in 1828 by Stansbury in the schools. And this was the question regarding the First Amendment. To answer your question, it said, what was the subject of the First Amendment? The answer was the subject of religious freedom. What do you mean by that? I mean the right every man has to worship God in such way as he thinks fit without being called to account for his opinions or punished for them. Mm-hmm. Is it a sacred right which ought to be guarded? Certainly. God alone is the judge of our religious freedom.
With all due respect, this is not even on point. Nobody's denying your religious freedom.
Oh, that's right.
I'm getting to the question about, you say that the First Amendment requires you to acknowledge God. Thomas Jefferson said he didn't care whether his neighbor believed in 20 gods
That's right.
or no God.
That's right.
Well, that contradicts just
no,
what you said.
No, that doesn't contradict.
He doesn't have to acknowledge God to be an American.
Thomas Jefferson was talking about religious freedom. Now, if you want to know about religious freedom, Thomas Jefferson, let me tell you what he said in the Bill for Religious Freedom, which I have right here.
Just accept my point, yes or no. Thomas Jefferson says you don't have to. The First Amendment does not require you to acknowledge God.
It does not require anybody to believe a certain way. And you've got to understand that
they could believe in no God, correct?
That's right. That is right.
Okay, all right, we got that
That's
right. Now, I'd like to talk to you about the Ten Commandments, because you said that you say the Ten Commandments are the basis of our law, right?
But before we leave that, and you talk about Thomas Jefferson and what he believed, there's the Bill for Religious Freedom. Mm-hmm. In the first sentence, it says, well aware that the opinions and beliefs of men depend not upon their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed by their mind, that Almighty God hath created the mind free, and manifested His supreme will, that free it shall remain, by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint. That was the purpose of the First Amendment.
Judge, not denying he said that, that does not support putting a Christian religious monument in the lobby of a public building. But I want to come back to...
I disagree with you, because I think that putting a monument to acknowledge that God has been acceptable throughout our history and is not forbidden by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution.
There's a test that the Supreme Court generally uses called the Lemon test.
Do you know why they use that test?
Because there's no better that's been devised yet.
No, because they can't address the law. Congress shall make no law respecting established religion. Do you know what they say? You know what the Lemon test is?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you right now and tell our viewers right now.
Oh, sure.
There are 3 points generally.
3.
First of all,
must have a secular purpose.
Does it have a secular purpose, right? Secondly, is neither enhances nor institutes a religion.
Right.
And thirdly,
cannot be excessive entanglement between government and religion.
Exactly.
Now tell me what religion means.
But your monument,
tell me what religion means.
Your monument fails that test.
No, it doesn't.
You yourself said.
No, it doesn't.
Judge, you yourself said by saying it's a religious monument. Therefore, it doesn't have a secular purpose.
Ask you this.
In fact, you have criticized people, have you not, that say, well, let's just say this is historical. And you say, no. The essence
it's not
here
just
is
historical.
Exactly.
You're right.
So
I agree with you
100%. You fail the Lemon test.
No, I didn't. I'm not failing the First Amendment. I'm not even failing the Lemon test until you tell me what religion is. Can you tell me? Can you define the religion?
Not up to me to define religion. I think
Who's it up to?
It's a set. Well, what's that have to do with anything?
You mean you can't define a word and you're going to interpret a statute?
I can define any word you want.
Define religion under the First Amendment.
I'll give you my
I don't want your definition. I want the legal definition.
Guess what? I'm not a lawyer,
it.
and I'm not a judge, and I'll
Guess
tell you.
what? Federal District Judge Myron Thompson said he did not have the expertise to define the word religion. Indeed, thought it was dangerous and unwise to define the word.
He's an honest man. I read your book.
He's honest.
Listen, I read your book, Judge. I know you make a big deal of that. The fact is, you got caught by every judicial level in this country of being wrong. You have defied them. You put yourself above the law. You made yourself a god, in effect, and said, I'm right, and they're all wrong.
No.
So you can quibble about some definition, Judge, but it's not on point.
I didn't put myself above the law. The federal district judge put himself above the law when he denied the purpose and the intent of the First Amendment. I can define the word religion, and you know where I get my definition. The United States Supreme Court. James Madison, who proffered the First Amendment, and all of forefathers, to include George Mason and Joseph Story, who I have right here as a Supreme Court justice for 34 years. It was defined as the duties we owe to the Creator in the manner of discharging it. The definition itself recognizes God, and they don't want to define the word because they can't recognize God.
You keep coming back to this as if somebody is preventing you from acknowledging God, preventing you from exercising your religion, preventing you from...
Do you think that you can acknowledge God?
Nobody has done that.
Do you think you can acknowledge God?
I can acknowledge God. I do every day. But let me tell you something. For example,
I'm asking you.
For example, there's we have the inauguration of the President of the United States. Now, you want to acknowledge God. You couldn't stand out there with a huge banner on that Capitol steps and say, Jesus is Lord, or whatever you want. The park police would cart you off. You could say, Roy Moy would say, well, they're preventing me from acknowledging God. No, they're not. They're saying in that place, that statement is unacceptable, which is what all the courts said about your monument in Alabama. In that place, that monument, which was pushing one God over the other,
so the court can
unacceptable.
Decide when you can acknowledge God and where? Is that right?
I believe so.
So in other words, it's not the acknowledgement of God, it's where and when you acknowledge God. The President of the United States can place his hand on this Bible.
And how? That's right.
On this Bible and say, so help me God.
That's right.
But a federal or judge can't not put a monument.
No, you just said it right. And I think you ought to think about that. That the courts can say what's legal and what's not, what's constitutional and what's not. But I want to come back to
They can tell what you think.
But I want to come back to the Ten Commandments.
That's what you're saying.
I want to come back to the Ten Commandments, which you say the Ten Commandments are basically our law is based upon the Ten Commandments, right?
Yes.
Which version? Are you talking about the original version in Exodus 20, or the second version in Exodus 34, or the third version in Deuteronomy 5?
Well, you're like you're like so many that want to divert the issue from what the true issue is.
Well, you just
The
wanted me
issue
to
was
define
not-
religion, so I'm
let me
asking you to
finish.
tell me which of the
Will
Ten
you let me
Commandments.
finish? Let me
Please.
finish. Okay, the federal judge in this case did not go to different versions of the Ten
I
Commandments.
asked you, not the judge, you.
The federal judge in this case said the monument to the Ten Commandments was not necessarily wrong in a public building. He said when you acknowledge the Judeo-Christian God from whence they came, you've crossed the line between the permissible and impermissible. Now, the point is, in this case, is that it was removed because it acknowledged God, not because there was a different version of the Ten Commandments. Any version of the Ten Commandments would acknowledge this God, and I would have no problem with that.
Well, if you say this is the basis of our law, I'm not talking about that. What's in the rotunda, that piece of marble there. I'm talking about you tell me this is the basis of our law, which frankly I don't believe. But before we get there, I have to know, like you want to know my definition, look, I'm a Catholic, okay?
Sure.
My Catholic catechism doesn't give me the same Ten Commandments that your Protestant Bible might, or your Protestant catechism, or that members of the Jewish faith might follow. So who decides which version first of the Ten Commandments is the basis of our law?
There is no unauthorized version of the Ten Commandments. Whoever puts a monument up can put the Ten Commandments up as they choose. That's the essence of freedom. Let me ask you this.
So
would
any
you
version.
disagree with the federal judge's opinion, which I contain right here, who said that it was not about the Ten Commandments, it was about the acknowledgement of the Judeo-Christian God? He said, when you recognize this God. Now, you're a Catholic, you said.
Yeah, but I just...
Let me ask you about your faith.
No, my faith is not a question here.
Well, do
I'm
you
not
think
making
that
an issue
God...
of my faith, Judge, but
No,
you've made an issue of yours. But
No,
and also, I don't want
You ask about the establishment of this country on God. Do you believe that it was not established on a God or God's law?
I believe it was established on the natural law, and that the rights we have come from whom we are as God's creatures. That's my belief. Now,
I believe that too. I believe that too. Should you recognize that
Okay.
God to guarantee those rights?
Judge, nobody's stopping you from recognizing God, nor me. Now, the question is, the Ten Commandments as the basis of our law. It's nothing to do with that decision. It's nothing to do with the rotunda.
Sure.
I'm trying to move the discussion along. When you look at the Ten Commandments as the basis of our law,
Sure.
which you contend, when I look at them, I don't see that to be the case. Let's just take them. This is from my Catholic Catechism. The first one, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve.
Right.
Second, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain.
Right.
Third, you shall keep holy the Sabbath.
Right.
Now, none of those apply to today's law.
Absolutely do.
Well, where?
Will you let me finish my answer when I answer?
Where?
They're the first table of the law. They're called the duties you owe to the Creator and the manner of discharging it. Those duties. Let me finish.
Our law.
I am talking, but you won't let me finish my answer, sir. If you're going to let me finish my answer, I'll talk to you.
Well, I just want to be sure we're on point. That's
We're
all.
on point. The first table of the law is outside of interference from the government. That's why we've got the First Amendment, to prohibit government from interfering with those rights. Without an understanding that there are duties we owe to God and the manner of discharging those duties, there would be no First Amendment. So it's the very basis of the First Amendment.
Okay, let me be
and that's
sure.
what I was reading out of
sure.
the elementary catechism.
Let me be sure I'm making myself clear. You
Sure.
say that the Ten Commandments are the basis of American law. I'm asking you where in American law, in our law as Americans, that we are bound to obey, not what we might believe from this book, the Bible, as Americans what we're bound to obey. Where is there any reflection of those first three commandments?
That's the point. That's the point. The first commandments are the table of the law which restricted government from interfering with it. That's why you've got the First Amendment, and that's the basis of the First Amendment, is an understanding that there are duties you owe to God, and the manner of discharging those duties is outside of government interference, as Thomas Jefferson, as James Madison clearly said.
Can you show me any, let's take the fourth one, honor thy father and thy mother. Can you quote me any law that Americans have to obey, passed by any city council, any state legislature, any Congress, at any time, that says, I know we should, but any law that says we have to honor our father and mother?
It is a recognition upon which the juvenile laws and the laws of every state are built upon honoring parents. In other words, obeying your parents, parental authority. That's where we get parental authority. That's where we get the right of parents to supervise the education of their children, to discipline their children, and to teach their children. That's the whole point of the law, is to recognize what was fundamental in the law.
But again, as far as laws enacted into statute, you could not quote one.
We've got all kind of juvenile laws. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's all kind of responsibility of parents over children.
No, I'm talking about honor thy father and thy mother. The responsibility of children toward their parents if they don't honor them, if they curse them out, if they leave home, if they don't care for them, against the law.
But it's the basis of all our juvenile laws.
We get to the fifth one, thou shalt not kill. There's a connection there in our law. I would certainly grant that. And same thing with the next one. With the next one, you shalt no. Let's go to the next one. We're talking about 7. You shalt not commit adultery. Again, wrong thing to do. Most people consider it immoral. It's not against the law.
Throughout our history, there were laws against adultery. Since the courts have taken away that understanding, they've taken away that. But it was a foundation of laws against adultery. Even in the state of Alabama, we have a civil divorce upon which considers adultery to be a violation of the marital covenant. And it was recognized throughout history. I wrote an opinion on this as Chief Justice.
So we agree that's not against the law now. Thou shalt not steal is against the law. You got that one. 8, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. 9, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. So, in effect, there are only 2 out of the 10 commandments that bear any relation to the existing, listen to me, the existing body of American law, correct?
The 10 commandments are the revealed divine law out of the Holy Scriptures. When Thomas Jefferson established our country with the Declaration of Independence, he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He recognized this Creator God. But the first sentence of his declaration says, we're entitled to exist because of the laws of nature and of nature's God. Let me read to you a portion of the law in 1771 that recognized that God's law out of the Bible were a basis of natural law.
This isn't the Constitution?
This is an understanding of natural law on the Declaration of Independence.
This is the Declaration of Independence.
Sure.
This is not law. This is the Declaration of Independence.
Are you familiar with the United States Code Annotated?
Somewhat. I'm not a lawyer.
If you go and you look up organic law of the United States, it says it's a Declaration of Independence. That is the point, is that revealed divine law, the 10 Commandments, were a part of the natural law. It said the doctrines thus delivered, called about the revealed law, we call the revealed or divine law, and they're found to be only in the Holy Scriptures. These precepts, when revealed, are found upon comparison to be really a part of the original law of nature.
I want to quote you somebody who totally disagrees with you, and I think he knows what he's talking about, okay?
Sure.
I want to quote you President John Adams. He wrote a book called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States. And you would agree, John Adams, he was there in Philadelphia, he was there in the Congress, he was there in the White House. He knew what he was talking about. John Adams says the United States of America, this is what makes us great. I would add, that's not his words.
Where are you reading this from?
From A Defense of the Constitution of the Government of the United States. John Adams wrote, quote, the United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. It will never be pretended that any persons employed in that service of forming the new government had interviews with the gods or were in any degree under the influence of heaven, more than those who work upon ships or houses or laboring in merchandise or agriculture. It will be forever acknowledged that those governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses. John Adams says even if there were no God, we would still form the same government because we believe in the inherent worth
John Adams was second president of the United States, wasn't he?
That's correct.
He signed the Declaration of Independence, didn't he?
That's correct.
And that declaration says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
What was that phrase again?
that to secure these rights,
deriving their just powers
from the consent of the governed.
From the consent of the governed, not from God.
Now wait a minute.
From the
God gives rights.
Right.
Government is to secure the rights God gave us. You said something about John Adams. Let me tell you about George Washington, the first president.
I want you to reply to this first.
I am replying to that. He did not say.
So John Adams says there was no heavenly influence. It was not based on God.
John Adams does not say there was no heavenly influence, sir.
Right here? I just read
John
it.
Adams does not say. He said, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly unsuitable to the government of any other. John Adams followed George Washington. And George Washington, in his inaugural address on April 30th, 1789, said, no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. You will join with me, I trust, in thinking there are none under the influence of which the proceedings of a new and free government can more auspiciously commence.
Roy Moore,
we're going to
take a break. When we come back, I want to ask you about some of the other issues that you talk about in the book.
I hope we talk about the book.
Because you're never talked a lot about the book. We've talked almost exclusively about what you talk about in the book and probing behind it. We're going to talk about some of the other issues you get into in the book when we come back. Roy Moore, we continue our conversation. Your book, So Help Me God,
Yes.
as I said at the beginning of the show, sort of a combination memoir and political call to arms. And you talk about a lot of issues here, not just the Ten Commandments monument. Page 154, I think it is, you dissented, or at least you expressed an opinion in an Alabama Supreme Court decision that had to do with parental rights for a lesbian woman, I believe. And you wrote, quote, homosexual conduct is and has been considered abhorrent, immoral, detestable, a crime against nature, and a violation of the laws of nature and nature's God upon which the nation and our laws are predicated. Do you think that homosexuality should be illegal?
Homosexuality was illegal in many of the states across this union until the United States Supreme Court in Lawrence v. Texas said otherwise. And if you'll read further there, we're not talking about people, we're talking about conduct which was historically and legally forbidden under the Constitution and under the laws of every state.
Well, again, I'm not a lawyer, but isn't it fair to say that homosexuality was not illegal, but there were certain sexual acts, like sodomy, that were illegal, correct?
Homosexual conduct, right.
Homosexuality was not illegal.
Homosexual conduct was illegal. Yes.
I think we're saying the same thing. I didn't hear you say that the first time. Well, do you think it should be still illegal today?
What I think is that it was illegal under the law, that the Supreme Court usurped the role of the legislatures and ruled something about our moral law that is improper. And so that's what we're finding that the Supreme Court and the federal district courts are doing daily. They've usurped the moral prerogative. Now, if you want
I don't understand your answer. I think it's a yes or no. Do you think that homosexuality or homosexual conduct should be illegal today? That's a yes or no question.
Homosexual conduct should be illegal. Yes.
Should be illegal.
Yes.
That means that what two consenting adults do behind the privacy of their closed bedroom door should be illegal activity?
It is immoral. It is defined by the law as detestable. It was against the law in most states until the Supreme Court in Lawrence v. Texas said that it wasn't. So we're talking about 2003, and Justice Scalia of the United States Supreme Court said the same thing in the case of Roper versus Simmons, which was just ruled upon this month, in which he said that the United States Supreme Court has usurped the legislative role, and they've ruled things on our morality, and in assuming that have turned to international law and foreign courts to adopt a new standard of morality.
But we're not talking the Bible. We're not talking what your faith tells you, Roy Moore. We're talking about what this Constitution tells you.
Sure.
Show me where in the Constitution you would find any evidence at all for making homosexual conduct illegal.
You look through that Constitution and you find nothing about morality. You find nothing about marriage between a man and a woman. It was based on.
You said wait a minute.
Let me finish. Morality is based on God. That's why you do not find it in the Constitution. Where do you think we get our morality? From some book of Hinduism or Islam? We get our morality from the Holy Bible upon which this nation was founded. That's why John Adams, who you quote, said our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly unsuitable to the government of any other. So, our morality is not defined by statutory law. It comes from the common law and recognition of the Bible and biblical precepts.
I didn't ask you about morality. Sure. I asked you about legality. I think there's a difference.
I thought you were asking about homosexuality.
Should it be illegal? You said yes,
and I said immoral conduct.
No. You said it should be illegal.
Yes, it's immoral conduct and was against the law.
So I'm asking you, where in the Constitution, not the Bible, I respect your faith. I disagree with it. I respect it. Where in the Constitution do you find any basis for a law that would say that consenting sexual activity between consenting adults in the privacy of the room should be illegal? What do you base that on?
There's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes that. The Constitution was based on the morality established in the Holy Scriptures. And because a group of judges went off and adopted foreign law out of France and Germany and the Court of European Rights, which do you realize that the Supreme Court overturned Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986, in which they found explicitly that there was no right in the Constitution to commit sodomy. They found that in 1986. 17 years later, in Lawrence v. Texas, they turned to international law and the law of the European Court of Human Rights to find that sodomy should be permitted.
Well, maybe they turned to the 14th Amendment. Judge, if you can't find anything, I can find it for you.
Now, I didn't say I couldn't find it.
All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And it continues, no state, you know this better than I, shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deny any person of life, liberty, or property, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. They may be homosexuals. They're Americans, Judge. You say that there should be laws specifically against this one group of Americans.
I'm telling you that in 1986, the 14th Amendment was far in force. It had been here for many years. And the United States Supreme Court found there was no right to commit sodomy in the Constitution. Now, 17 years later, they turned to the Court of European Rights to establish a right that was never recognized in this country. Well, and it is absolutely wrong, and it's a usurpation of the legislative prerogative.
Wrong, but I've asked you now maybe 3, maybe 5 times to show me, again, not the Bible. Well, let me ask you that question. Do you think it's a job of the government to pass laws that enforce this book, the Bible?
No, the laws of the government are bound by the Constitution of the United States, which is founded upon the law of God.
Thank you. Okay, now where in the Constitution do you find any support for your position that you can outlaw certain kinds of sexual activity which you don't approve of?
I find no support in the Constitution whatsoever to authorize sodomy in our law. And that was adopted by the United States Supreme Court by turning to international law, not to the Constitution they're sworn to uphold. In fact, Article 6 of the Constitution says it's this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which is the supreme law of the land, not the Court of European Rights. Our Supreme Court simply acted as a legislative body in overturning the laws of virtually every state regarding sodomy.
What you are saying, Judge, is that you want certain Americans to have not the same rights as the others, therefore, in effect, to be second-class citizens. If you are the one that's taking their rights away, it seems to me you have to find support for that in the Constitution. I don't have to find support in the Constitution for letting them be full Americans with the same rights that you and I have.
You've got to understand, just because it's done behind closed doors, it can still be prohibited by state law. Do you know that bestiality, the relationship between man and beast, is prohibited in every state? Do you know that?
Did I ask you about having sex with a cow?
No, you didn't. But
or a horse?
It's the same thing.
No, it's not the same. You mean homosexuality is the same thing as bestiality?
It is a moral precept upon which this country was founded. Now, we can talk all day about morality and avoid talking about the book, but in this book, I describe and define where our morality comes from, and it does not come from statutory law, it comes from the Bible.
Judge, in this book, you talk about this issue we just talked about,
Surely.
obviously because it's important to you.
Surely.
You also talk about adultery.
Sure.
And let's go to page 156 in the book.
That's another moral precept.
Where you say that, if I may, to destroy the conclusive. I'm sorry, that was the. That was the sentence about the previous subject here about the custody of the child. Let's go to adultery without just quoting you exactly. You believe that the court should have ruled in one case that the court is wrong, if I can put it that way, basically not to pursue adultery or to condone it. Correct? That is immoral behavior, and therefore the court should make it what, illegal?
No, I was simply quoting Alabama law, which recognized that morality was a basis upon which, that adultery was a basis upon which to apply to a custody situation, and the court avoided that and allowed a court of appeal, a lower court ruling that said it had to be shown that adultery had a bad effect on the children to have an effect. So I was talking about Alabama law, which is also the law in many states.
So what is your point of view on adultery?
Adultery is prohibited in Alabama by saying that if you do such a thing, you could lose custody of your children in a divorce situation.
That's sufficient reason, you believe?
Sufficient reason for what?
Not to get custody of a child because you once committed adultery?
You have to weigh all the facts in the case, and I think it is a presumption that has to be overcome by other things. Sure, I do.
Adultery should be legal or illegal?
Adultery is not recognized in many states still today. It's up to the laws of the state. And certainly most states recognize that adultery was an immoral act and was recognized in law throughout history.
Well, on all of these issues we're talking about, what I'm trying to get at is morality and legality, and what I believe most people see is a big difference.
No,
where
the legality recognizes most immorality.
And this is the other book, and this book doesn't necessarily lead to this book, and this book is not all about enforcing this book, correct?
And that book was founded upon that book.
But
now, if you want to know that,
this book is not the same.
It's not the same, of course, but it was the laws of nature and of nature's God. It was the revealed divine law upon which the Constitution exists. Here in my hand is Federalist number 43, January 23rd, 1788, written by James Madison, the chief architect of the Constitution, in which he discusses Article 7 of the Constitution, which says 9 states could adopt the Constitution. He said, how can that be? And then he answered his question. He said the first question could be answered at once by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God.
Judge,
so he's quoting what Jefferson said in the Declaration.
This has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Sure, it has everything to do. We were talking about the relationship between the Constitution and the Bible.
No, I mean,
that's what you asked me.
Filibuster from the bench, but we have limited time here. Let's talk about it. I'm just
you asked me the question. I'm answering you the question
with a big tangent. Let's talk about another issue you talk about here
that you won't look at.
Let's talk about another issue here, which is gambling.
Sure. Gambling, yeah.
Again, according to this book, you may consider gambling immoral. According to this book, do you believe gambling should be illegal?
We're not ruling according to the Constitution. We're ruling the state of Alabama in my book, which said that gambling was illegal. A lottery was illegal because it was based on pure chance, and the laws of our state to this day forbid such conduct. It's not something that you have to turn to the Constitution for. It was in the laws of the state. You've got to understand that in every state has laws, and then you've got the Constitution of the United States. And they're both law of the land in Alabama, for example.
I'm just trying to ascertain,
sure.
Curious, your belief about gambling, whether you think it should be illegal in the states, whether it should be illegal in Alabama.
What I believe is not relevant. It is illegal in Alabama. Go to Alabama, open the book, and find out. In many states, there's laws against chance, pure chance. When you risk something on pure chance, it was called a lottery. And we clarified the law on the English rule versus the American rule. And we looked back through centuries of American law and found that games of chance were considered illegal and recognized prohibition in the Constitution of Alabama, which exists today. So I'm not talking about the Constitution or anything about the Bible. I'm talking about what the law says.
And you think it should be illegal?
It is illegal. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what I think. That's the whole point. A judge doesn't rule by his feelings. He rules by the law. And the law says it is illegal.
What about another area you may or may not touch on the book where you may think the courts have gone too far? What about the issue of school prayer? That the courts have several times said that no prayer in the classroom.
Do you know the United States Supreme Court opens with prayer?
Of course I do.
How can the United States Supreme Court and Congress open with prayer and forbid it to school children?
Because they're the court is the quick answer.
So the court,
but do you
court
think
can determine that conduct performed by children is wrong, but by themselves is right.
Well,
it's illogical, and it's certainly wrong. If Congress can open with prayer, if the Supreme Court can open with prayer, school children should open with prayer.
The members of the Supreme Court also wear a black robe. Doesn't mean I have to wear a black robe. And in the arguments, and
it doesn't mean they're God either.
Just the other day, in front of the Supreme Court about the Ten Commandments, someone raised that question, and they made the point. It does depend on the context. That's an historic thing. If they get rid of it, I wouldn't have a problem. But I want to talk about the kids. So you've got school children. Do you believe then there should be school prayer in the classroom? Prayer in the classroom.
There's nothing in the Constitution that stops an acknowledgement of God. To force children to pray or to force anybody to believe a certain way is wrong. And certainly if school children were forced to pray a certain way, that would not be proper.
Well, who writes the prayer?
Who writes the prayer? I guess the person, if it's written, that gives it. Just like in Congress, who writes the congressional prayer? The person that
the classroom, who would write the prayer for the kids?
Well, it depends on the context. I can't say you're going to have to give me a specific example. You're going to say if a teacher mandates a certain prayer that children have to be observed, that would be wrong. But if you're saying that children are allowed to pray in school, that would certainly be permissible.
I'm talking about, and you know what I'm talking about, an organized prayer. This is all the Supreme Court talked about. The Supreme Court never said kids can't pray in school. There will, you know as well as I, Roy Moore, there will always be prayer in school as long as there are math tests, right? I mean, as long as there are science tests, there'll be prayer in schools. Now, we're talking about what the Supreme Court addressed, which is an organized prayer at a given time that all the students participate in. Don't you think that is clearly an establishment of religion?
That's not what the Supreme Court has said. The Supreme Court in 1985, in the case of Wallace versus Jaffrey out of Alabama, said that you could not even put in legislative statute that children could have a moment of silence because it was a religious thing.
Because why?
Children can't even have...
Why? Because it was an organized time.
Because it recognized a supreme
when they all
God.
Had to pray.
It recognized the supreme God, which the United States Supreme Court has virtually removed from this country, the recognition of any higher authority, and yet they opened their courts with God Save the United States of this honorable court, which they have said in case law is a prayer. It is hypocrisy and should not be tolerated of men in black robes who have made themselves gods and not interpreters of the law.
I want to come back to the classroom, which you keep trying to avoid. This is a moment of silence or a moment of prayer, which is organized. What about the kids there who are non-believers?
What about the kids there who are atheists? The true issue is that religious freedom comes from God. And if they're atheists, they can believe no God. If they're Buddhist, they can believe in Buddha. And if they're Christian, they can believe in Christian principles in God.
Why should they all have to pray at one time?
They do not.
Led by a teacher who works for the state in a building that's owned by the state, that is paid for from taxpayer dollars. It seems to me, Judge, I want your legal mind, if that's not establishment of religion, I don't know what is.
Well, you don't know what is because you don't know the First Amendment. And I am a judge and I've studied this. And nothing in the First Amendment prohibits an acknowledgement of God. Historically, up until 1962, the schools of our state and nation opened with prayers. Nobody was made to participate in these prayers. But the fact is, prayer is not illegal and is not forbidden by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution simply because it recognizes God.
But you know what, Judge?
Yes.
Nobody has stopped them from recognizing God. Nobody has stopped, we come back, this is full circle. Nobody has stopped you from acknowledging God. You yourself admitted in this interview that there are limits. There are times when it's proper. There are times when it's not. There are ways that it's proper.
That's
There
right.
are ways that it's not.
When it's defined by establishment, which I have the court records of the United States Congress who identified what an establishment of religion was.
Okay,
If you will let me read from this.
I don't think we have time for that.
Well, you don't have time because you don't want to hear the truth. My goodness.
I think we've heard a lot, Judge.
Well,
I want to ask you about the basic question, I guess, which you've referred to obliquely at least a couple of times. In fact, you said in a speech in Tennessee back in 2002 that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and it's time to take back our land.
Yeah.
Are we a Christian nation?
The United States Supreme Court in 1892 said, "These and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation." I'm quoting
That's
the United States Supreme
Trinity
Court.
versus the United States.
That's right. I'll also quote the 1931 case of U.S. versus McIntosh when Justice Sutherland wrote this: "We are a Christian people, according to one another the equal right of religious freedom and acknowledging with reverence the duty of obedience to the will of God." The Chief Justice at that time
he was
wrote
quoting which decision?
Church of the Holy Trinity.
He was quoting Trinity. So let's
And
go back
then-
to Trinity. You know what the Trinity decision was all about, don't you?
I surely do.
Which was?
They had an invited pastor, I think it was from England, to come over at a certain school. But the recognition
the ruling in the court
was not that it was a Christian nation by establishment,
Exactly.
but that it was a Christian nation by its institutions, its laws, its principles, and so forth. You got to understand that even the Christian faith cannot be established by law. No one can be punished for not being a Christian or for worshiping in another way. But that doesn't mean that this is not a Christian nation in establishment. In fact, as early as the Mayflower Compact, they said, "We've undertaken this voyage for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith."
I know about the Mayflower Compact, and that is not the Constitution. It is not the law of the land. And just to clarify for our viewers, again, to be sure they understand, so in the Church of the Trinity, the Holy Trinity Church in New York wanted to bring in a minister from England.
Sure.
There was an act that the Congress had passed at that time forbidding importing workers for manual labor. The court ruled that this was not manual labor because he was coming to preach. Therefore, that was the ruling. And then in the dictum, the court, whoever wrote the opinion, I forget his name right now, talked about the fact that this is a Christian nation. So that was not the ruling of the court, that was the dictum as part of that decision. It did not establish us as a Christian nation, correct?
It recognized things throughout our history that were put in case law, just like I'm reading from U.S. versus McIntosh, where the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court said this.
Right, which is quoting
One
the same
cannot
decision.
speak, no, this wasn't quoting that. It says, "One cannot speak of religious liberty with proper appreciation of its essential and historic significance without assuming the existence of a belief in supreme allegiance to the will of God."
Well, then I want to ask you, if we are a Christian nation, then how
Not by establishment,
how
by
come the word
institution.
God does not appear in the Constitution? How come in the Constitution there is no religious test for holding public office? How come there is no requirement that you take the oath of office based on, with your hand on the Bible? And how come in the only oath that is in the Constitution, which as you know is the oath for president, the words "so help me God" don't appear? In other words, Judge, when our founding fathers had every opportunity to make this a Christian nation, I mean, God knows if they wanted to, they could have. I mean, they all believed in some kind of God. We don't have to get into that discussion. They had the opportunity there in Philadelphia. This is the rock upon which we're built.
Yeah.
Where is it? Why didn't they do it when they had the chance?
Like I said, they didn't do it because they wouldn't establish Christianity as a religion. But they did date it.
You just said we're a Christian nation.
I said not by establishment. You've got to understand, establishment means somebody is penalized for not being a Christian. There's a difference between establishment and a recognition of God. Indeed, in Article 7 of the Constitution, it says this, done in convention by unanimous consent of the states present, this 17th day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th.
Wait. That's given the date. That's like saying, you know, if we're at April 15th, 2005 AD, that means, you know, we're a Christian nation. You can't base the fact we're a Christian nation based on the date.
That was based on, that was based on the Gregorian calendar. Well, let me answer. It was based on the Gregorian calendar, which had not been adopted in England till some 15 or 20 years before this time. It was a specific recognition of the Lord in that date.
AD.
And also, it recognized the Declaration of Independence, which says that our rights come from God. And if they come from God, what God is it? You keep avoiding that answer.
No, I'm looking for the evidence.
What God are they talking about?
You know what? They didn't all believe in necessarily the same God. Most of them believed, as you know,
52 of the 55 signers were members of Christian Orthodox churches. What God do you think they're talking about?
Let me tell you something. I've heard that fact, and if that's true, which I don't believe, why?
What do you
believe? When Benjamin Franklin said, let's start with a prayer every day, why did only 3 and 4 say yes if 52 out of 55 were Christians? Why?
When are you talking about? When you're talking about Benjamin Franklin in the Constitutional Convention stood up and said, have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance?
And he said,
I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men.
And he said, let's start with a prayer. Let's start our sessions with a prayer. They were a month into the Constitutional Convention. And only 3 or 4, at most a half a dozen, voted to do it. If there were 52 out of 55, 52 out of 55, why didn't they vote for a prayer?
And the first thing they did when they reassembled, they appointed chaplains of Congress in both houses, which they have today. They did something more than opening with prayer. They appointed chaplains of Congress in both the House and the Senate.
Which James Madison opposed. Okay, there's no word of God in the Constitution.
James Madison didn't
oppose.
No
word of God in the Constitution. Yes, he did.
Chaplains.
You better check that.
No.
So let's talk about the one time that the United States did speak on this issue. And I'm talking about the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797. This was negotiated under George Washington. It was endorsed by President Adams. It was ratified unanimously by the United States Senate. And the first sentence says, as the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And it goes on.
Yeah, it goes on, and what it goes on is more
I'll read
important.
the rest of it, but I'm just saying.
Well, let me read it.
No, I'll read it. As it has in itself no character or enmity against the law, religion, or tranquility of Muslims.
That's right.
And as the states never have entered into any war, etc.,
that's right.
It says we basically are going to exist in harmony with the Muslim nations. But the first sentence, as the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. What part of those words do you not understand?
What I don't understand is what you're not concentrating on. You can't break a sentence into 2 phrases and take the first part and not talk about the second part. It said, as it has in no sense.
We're going to have good relations with the Muslim nations of Northern Africa.
May I see it?
Right there.
As it has in no sense enmity toward the Muslim faith. In other words, it's the same thing that Justice Sutherland was saying in U.S. versus McIntosh. We're a Christian people according to one another the right of equal freedom, not imposing it on other people or trying to take their land because we're Christian.
Here's the bottom line.
Sure.
George Washington says we're not a Christian nation. John Adams says
George Washington did not say we're not a Christian nation.
John Adams says we're not a Christian nation.
No.
Roy Moore says we are a Christian nation. Whom should I believe? Why should I believe Roy Moore?
The United States Supreme Court in 1892, the United States Supreme Court in 1931. You can look to William O. Douglas in 1961 in the case where he said that the institutions of our society, McGowan versus Maryland, are founded upon belief there's authority higher than the authority of the state, that there's a moral law which the state is powerless to alter, and that the individual possesses rights conferred by the Creator which government must respect. They recognized a higher sovereign God, and that God was the God of the Holy Scriptures.
What is next for Roy Moore? You going to run for governor of Alabama?
I've been asked many times, and I'm praying about it, and if I do, I shall, but it's certainly not time to make those decisions now.
Are you going to run again for Chief Justice of the Court of Alabama?
I have no idea right now what I will do in the future. That's still 2 years away nearly.
The book, Roy Moore, So Help Me God. Roy Moore, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it.